All right. So today is a special episode of Diet Soap. I've got Adrian Johnston with us here today. He is the author of Zizek's Ontology, amongst other books, and Chris Cutrone, whose book The Death of the Millennial Left is coming out soon from Sublation. I'm glad to have you both here. The idea behind this podcast, the idea of inviting you both on was to get a conversation going about the difference between Freud and Lacan, and to be more specific than that, the difference between the Frankfurt School's uh, deployment of Freudian psychoanalysis and the later Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis use of Lacan as a way to intervene in politics, I think is how I would set that up. And so I'm trying to discover where the differences are, how Freud is useful for both projects, and just to clear away some of the confusion in my own mind about the differences that exist between, let's say, Adorno and Zizek. So to begin with, I'm just going to describe what I think the situation is roughly. In an interview with Alfie Baum, who works with Sublation, he's the editor of the Sublation magazine online. Laden Dolar described how he came to Lacan. And the story roughly was that Zizek and the Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis split from the Praxis School. And the Praxis School was, critical of Titoism and informed by the Frankfurt School and by Western Marxism generally. They were humanists. They advocated a return to the real Marx that had been distorted by right-wing social democrats and Stalinists alike. They were inspired by Lukács, Bloch, Marcuse, Fromm, and others. And through Marcuse and Bloch and the Frankfurt School, they were informed by Freud. This is my basic understanding. The Ljubljana School broke with Praxis, finding structuralism and Lacan to be a liberation from the restrictions they felt in Tito's Yugoslavia and even within the dissident Praxis School. Structuralism was a movement set against Hegelianism at the beginning, and by extension, I think, against Marx. And yet it was taken up by this anti-humanist strain of Marxism as they reinterpreted Hegel without his historicism, and with more of an emphasis on the philosophical logic of the dialectic.
So I would just start with maybe something that you just said about the Ljubljana School, which is Hegel without historicism, right? And so I would say, my approach, I had exposure to Freud before I studied the Frankfurt School, before I really knew anything about the Frankfurt School. But also I had a certain understanding of Marxism before I came to the Frankfurt School. And what I've, always found to be very important about the Frankfurt School is their historicization of Freud. Meaning that Freud is not adopted simply as transhistorically true, but rather true about subjectivity in psychology and capitalism. And similarly, the way they understood, Kant and Hegel and others, other philosophers in the modern era, as also being very much of their historical moment. And in a fairly fine-grained way, meaning that there was already a significant, considerable historical shift between Hegel's time and Marx's time. One generation was enough to, change, the truth of Hegel's philosophy. And similarly, in their own time, the Frankfurt School observed what Marcuse called the obsolescence of Freud, as a function of actual changes in capitalism, in society. And so, again, the idea was that the split between the conscious and the unconscious mental process was an expression of the contradiction of capitalism. the reason that no one had a conception of this internally conflicted psychology before Freud is that perhaps it was not the case before Freud's time, before the late 19th century, before capitalism, before industrial capitalism in the Marxist sense of the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. So that the bourgeois subject had come into a self-contradiction in the industrial era in a way that had not been the case prior to that. And so we can't expect Kant and Hegel or Adam Smith to be Marxists, right? But nonetheless, Marx and Freud occupy a similar historical moment, namely capitalism. But that there was a significant change in 20th century capitalism that seemingly invalidated Freud, and paradoxically invalidated Freud at the moment when Freud had his greatest currency, namely mid-20th century. Right. So that's, and the idea that ideology lags behind social reality and historical change, there's a lag, that that the psychological effects of capitalism might have taken a couple of generations to really register, so that Freud is expressing something in his own time that might be already a little bit of a lag. That might be a kind of a, rather than an early 20th century moment, it might actually express a change that had taken place in the 19th century, namely the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. So that's the Frankfurt School perspective in a nutshell on Freud.
Adrian, do you agree with my characterization at the start? And then is the historical approach to Freud that you've just heard Chris take up at odds with a Zizekian or Lacanian understanding of psychoanalysis?
Well, I should begin by noting that, Doug, you pointed out that what you were doing was, in a way, paraphrasing Mladen Dolar's way of talking about the origins of the Ljubljana school in the late 1960s and 1970s in the former Yugoslavia. And I would not be the one to dispute the accuracy of his account, since he was one of the central actors in the very genesis of that movement. And in fact, when I was in Ljubljana last May, I had a number of long conversations with him about the origins of the Ljubljana school and how he and Zizek met initially, and what was involved in terms of what they were doing in relation to the theoretical and political landscape at the time. So I can't put myself forward honestly as speaking for them at that level. And moreover, I would say that with Mladen talking about the origins of the Ljubljana school, that's of course one thing, but then what it has ended up morphing into over the intervening decades, and what the state of play is in terms of discussions of various issues within the Ljubljana school, and amongst those of us who are one could say fellow travelers of them, it's a more, I think, complex landscape at this point. And among other things, I certainly think everyone involved with this orientation today can see some of the limits of classical mid-20th century French structuralism. Those are a few caveats that I would like to present up front. And I mean, at this point, I think that what would be best for me to do is to speak for myself, although I would say that much of what I have to say, I think is in line with certain of the positions staked out by Zizek, Dolar, Zupancic, etc. And to begin with, apropos the historicizing of Freud, yes, that's the signature hallmark gesture of the Western Marxist engagement with psychoanalysis, particularly as per the first generation of the Frankfurt School. And my initial response to it is that certainly I think that there are some aspects to Freud's edifice that Freud himself did not historicize but should have. But on the other hand, I think that there are numerous aspects to Freud's framework, including what Freud would identify as really the load-bearing conceptual pillars of his metapsychological edifice, which Freud, of course, would stick to his guns and say, no, that at the level of, if we're going to talk about this as historical, it would be at the level of natural history or evolution. And what we're dealing with here are forces and factors that are very much a part of what we might loosely call human nature, or what the young Marx would have called Gattungswesen following Feuerbach, and that it is a much harder to try and historicize those things away. I mean, central analytic concepts like trieb, drive in Freud's sense, or, other aspects of his account of the fundaments of the working of the libidinal economy, independently of questions of whether he was uncritically, ahistorical about things like the bourgeois nuclear family, et cetera. And so I think it's just too sweeping to say either you have to have, you have to stick to an original Freud who was, anti-historical and just a kind of naive universalizer about everything that he was, putting forward, which I don't think was the case with Freud originally himself anyhow. Or the idea that, you just have to historicize everything all the way down. And I think that not even someone like Marcuse, really does that, because he still relies on the notion that although the way in which these things are historically mediated and inflected can shift, I mean, he still tacitly banks on the idea of a certain transhistorical validity to a category like drive, a la Freud. And so I don't even think that the Frankfurt School, or at least the Marcusean classical formulation of Freudo-Marxism, a la 1955's Eros and Civilization, I don't think that Marcuse could be, a pan-historicizer who would just go all the way down, and say every last bit of this is contingent upon basically the capitalist mode of production and its corresponding social formations. I don't think that Marcuse could even remain consistent with aspects of his own endeavor and go that far. And then what's interesting too is if you go back to Marx, I mean, on my reading of Marx, I'm sorry, Marx was not, you might risk calling this sort of position sort of reductive pan-historicism, right? Where it's like everything is historical all the way down, with no exceptions whatsoever. We can never make any, trans-historical claims and so on. That I think clearly is not even the case for Marx himself. And that Marx, was well aware that a lot of what was involved in historical materialism as he was working it out, very much presupposed and rested upon the foundations provided by what we could loosely call a philosophical anthropology. And one of my senses is that Freud and Lacan, at the level of their metapsychologies, provide absolutely crucial ingredients for precisely the sort of philosophical anthropology that Marxist historical materialism, inclusive, of course, of its account of history, has to at least presuppose, if not posit, for its own theoretical consistency and coherence. And so, I think that one can, I just refuse to choose between, historicism or ahistoricism. It's a much more complicated picture, but I would say it's also much more complicated for the original figures themselves, or both Freud and Lacan, and attempting to position the two of them with regard to this kind of schematization of positions in this starker black and white fashion, I think will just lead to a mishandling of the two original sources in question here.
Is there a difference between, I mean, maybe we shouldn't talk about the Praxis School particularly, but between today's advocates of the Frankfurt School, or people who would look to the Frankfurt School to understand the political significance of Freud, and the Lacanian left's understanding of Freud through Lacan, and is the difference somewhere in the vicinity of a different conception of what's historical and what's innate in human psychology? Is that a point of difference at all between the two approaches?
I could clarify what I mean by historical.
Yeah.
Which is maybe going to complicate things a great deal. Meaning I think that we have a kind of historicist notion of the historical that we have to sort of dispense with. because it wouldn't be true to Hegel, it wouldn't be true to Marx, and it wouldn't be true to the Frankfurt School. Namely, we're not talking about like points in time. We're not talking about, this moment versus that moment. We're talking about a historical process. In other words, capitalism has deep historical roots. And those historical roots extend to natural history. Of course they do. And that's why the Frankfurt School got into trouble with dialectic of enlightenment, where they said maybe capitalism is inherent in organic life itself, the principle of eating and being eaten, right? I mean, they did do these things, Adorno and Horkheimer. And so, or even the way Marx talks about the origins of bourgeois society going back to classical antiquity, seeing, bourgeois categories at work in Aristotle. Castoriadis wrote about this. So I think that if we understand it as a historical process rather than just discrete moments in time, because that's the kind of historicist notion, which of course Marxists like Lukács and Benjamin and the Frankfurt School are savagely critical of historicism. So we're not talking about historicism here. We're talking about how do we make sense of an unfolding and continuing historical process from within that process. In other words, it's not just, eternal or a point in time. That's not the difference that I think we have to grapple with. Historical specificity means something else. It means within a historical process that's been unfolding.
Well, just in response to that, though, two things. I mean, one, even if we think of what we're talking about here as history as processual rather than punctual, I think that Doug's question still remains, which is that, all right, does one posit that there are invariant dimensions throughout whatever process or processes one is looking at that play an enabling or condition of possibility style role with regard to those processes, and that themselves do not just rise and fall in the flow of the unfolding of whatever process in question? So I think there's that issue, and related to that, in my view, one has to also distinguish between history or various senses of historicism from a certain notion of historicity, in terms of historicity not being itself historical, but really, at the level of what I was earlier referring to as philosophical anthropology, identifying the invariant features of the makeup of humanity and of human subjects, such that they are historical creatures, right? And insofar as if you were to say we are always, no matter which instances of humanity or human subjects one is looking at, we are always historical. Well, then the question of what is that constancy that allows for that always when we talk about the always historical status of them? And I think at that level, at least as the kind of philosopher that I am, I think you have to shift to a level where you're talking about more of a transcendental analysis of the possibility conditions for being historical, and those themselves, on pain of incoherence, cannot be treated as just one more set of transitory, whether processual or punctual, historical factors among others.
Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This immaturity is self-imposed if its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Dare to know, sapere aude, from the Latin. Have courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment.
Christy, mentioning Aristotle, and of course Aristotle's famous discussion of what for him was a marginal outlying economic factor, namely, merchants' greed, etc., and talking about it as bourgeois. But in my view, that sounds anachronistic. It's not that Aristotle is bourgeois; it's that what he was identifying as a fringe phenomenon, in the context of the Greek socioeconomic framework, was there, but long before there was anything bourgeois on the historical horizon. But then, of course, once you have capitalism, this feature that is already discerned by someone in the ancient Greek world circa 400 BC goes from being an outlying aspect to becoming, the central engine, propelling the mode of production that is capitalism along. And so that to me is not that Aristotle was bourgeois. That just goes to the point of, not everything that is crucial to capitalism here is part of a process that itself can all be subsumed under the general heading of capitalism or bourgeois, et cetera. And so that is where I get kind of concerned, because if you stretch the process out long enough, then you basically will commit a mistake that Marx himself would have pulled his hair out when confronted with, which would be like, you have to respect the distinctness of capitalism as it emerges for Marx in the early 16th century, and to elongate it so that you basically can call things stretching all the way back to, say, slave-based antiquity as also bourgeois. I think for Marx that would be a real worry.
No, I wouldn't. So I wouldn't quite do that. But I was just pointing out, again, something maybe a little bit different. So, namely that I think that the claim with Marx, it's in various of his writings. I think it might be in the Grundrisse. He's making a claim about like the deep roots of the commodity form at the level of like what people call the, I think it's the axial revolution, the emergence of abstract thinking. Right.
Yeah.
And Marx does make a claim about that. In other words, that there's something about abstraction and abstract thinking that is developed via the commodity form and therefore can trace its origins to deep historical civilization. Still a rather late development of civilization, relatively speaking, but still ancient from our perspective. So there's that. So just to clarify what I'm saying, that you could find the roots of bourgeois society in ancient Athens, not in ancient Sparta, but in Athens, right? And that has something to do with trade and the commodity form and the status of labor being different in Athens than in other ancient cities of the Mediterranean. There's that. The other point that I'd make, just to identify, just to help our viewers, historicity. So historicity is Heidegger. And Heidegger is responding to Marxism and also to the crisis of historicism, meaning there is an early 20th century moment where it's clear that a late 19th century historicism, which Lukács, for example, calls a reified view of history, presents a conundrum. And then, of course, Heidegger has to respond to Hegel, has to respond to historicism as it emerges in the 19th century, and also has to respond to Marxism and the claims that Marxism makes about human nature. And Heidegger is trying to criticize Marxism for actually assuming a kind of Western metaphysics of labor, essentially, that reaches all the way back and that goes back to classical antiquity and can be found in Plato and Aristotle, and can be found to be something that the pre-Socratics are wrestling with. And what I want to say is that the 20th century, the reason that Heidegger is so influential for people like Lacan and people who come after Lacan, is that capitalism does raise these questions. How deep does this problem go? Is it a fundamental problem of Western metaphysics? How do we understand this? And I would say that while I think that Heidegger, in comparison to the Frankfurt School, lacks historical specificity with regards to capitalism, I would also say that, following the Frankfurt School, that there's something authentic about what Heidegger is trying to grapple with this category of historicity. So it's not, again, how do we understand how and why this problem arises when it does historically?
I want to ask a clarifying question, because I'm a little lost at this point, and I think the viewers would be a little lost. Like, I want to know what Heidegger thought, or what generally people believed in the
temporality, how we experience temporality, ecstatic temporality, the fact that we're not bound to a moment in time.
Let me articulate
part of human
let me
nature.
articulate the question.
Right.
So, what was the conception of history or historicity that came out of the 19th century that presented a philosophical problem or a difficulty that Heidegger felt he had to overcome? What was it about that? And maybe Adrian, if do you want?
Well, I mean, I'm wondering whether this should be pursued, just because, for me at least, this is a bit of a red herring in that, yes, I take the term historicity and use it to distinguish, that level of analysis from what would be involved in what we would consider to be more familiar senses of what it is to look at things from a historical vantage point. But I should say, I mean, I am one of the most vehemently anti-Heideggerian people I think you could meet. I have despite this term, being associated with Heidegger, I have no commitments to, and in fact, grave reservations about Heideggerian phenomenology generally, his analytic of Dasein specifically, and that moreover, for me, coming at this more from the Marxist side of things, when we talk about historicity as, in a sense, the transcendental conditions of possibility for historical phenomena, that I think that is in part what not so much Heideggerian existential phenomenology and phenomenological ontology, that we shouldn't look at that for giving us that account. I mean, Heidegger, of course, would beg to differ, but instead it's just that a lot of the aspects of what were involved with dialectical materialism is first developed by Engels and then carried forward primarily by the non-Western currents of Marxism, starting with the Soviets, etc. And that, of course, this was rubbished by the entire Western Marxist tradition, starting with the young Lukács in 1919, in a footnote to the opening chapter of History and Class Consciousness, What is Orthodox Marxism, in which he lambasts the entire Engelsian project of providing these these bigger picture, natural, historical level material conditions of possibility for the sort of history that's at stake in historical materialism, as focused specifically on human social history. That is more what for me would be involved in cashing out historicity in an admittedly very anti-Heideggerian fashion for a good number of reasons. But I should just say that for me at least, I have no investment in trying to defend Heidegger, and it doesn't have to do with the phenomenological experience of temporality. It does for Heidegger when talking about historicity, but certainly not for myself.
Okay, so let me just say something about just to clear,
I
know our
feel
viewers
like
know something about this, and so I just want to sort of say something about historical materialism and dialectical materialism, namely that that's itself a symptom that Marxism seems divided between historical materialism and dialectical materialism. I don't think that Marx or Engels themselves would have drawn the hard and fast line between those two things, and it would not appear to be a choice that you're either a dialectical materialist and therefore an Eastern Marxist, or you're a historical materialist and therefore you're a Western Marxist. That wouldn't really make sense to Marxism before Stalinism, basically. And so I think it's part of the dogmatization of Marxism, and also part of the experience of Marxism and the crisis of Marxism and the division of Marxism, that would itself have to be historicized, that this division between dialectical materialism is about nature and historical materialism is about society. Now, Lukács, I'm sympathetic to Lukács, but I also recognize that Lukács himself was working through his understanding of Marxism, especially as early as 1919. And the defense of history and class consciousness that he writes, that wasn't published until much later, Taylism and the Dialectic, has a second part on the dialectics of nature, in which he no longer is anti-Engels in this way, and it's under pressure of the people who are going to become the dialectical materialists in the Soviet Union.
One of the things I'm noticing in this conversation is that certain names that when they come up are charged. When we start talking, like Marx is charged, Heidegger is charged, but for someone who isn't as aware of the history or may not remember or have ever fully understood the philosophical arguments, the fact that they're charged isn't clarifying. So, for instance, with Heidegger, when he was approaching the problem of historicity, my question for you, Adrian, is, as someone who has I'm coming to you as like an undergraduate philosophy guy, right?
Right.
Not, what was the philosophical problem left over in the 19th century that people felt needed to be addressed? And did Heidegger address it in the wrong way, or was his answer, I can understand that it would have political consequences, which we would want to avoid, but was he actually taking up a real philosophical problem, or was he
bullshitting,
mystifying? And if he was taking up a real philosophical problem, did that problem remain after Heidegger for people interested in psychoanalysis and people who were interested in politics, people maybe in the Praxis school,
and for us,
and for us today?
Certainly, I think that, in terms of what I consider to be valuable that lurks in the background of what Heidegger is doing, and also what is motivating some of Heidegger's own complaints about, for example, Marxism, is, of course, Heidegger, along with Lukács, the young Lukács, both had deep roots in neo-Kantianism. And, I think that, and here I must say the Heidegger who I like the most is if there is a turn, the pre-turn Heidegger, the Heidegger of the first few years of his, really the takeoff of his philosophical career, the author of, Being and Time, Basic Problems of Phenomenology, and Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. So Heidegger essentially 1927 to 1930. And that Heidegger, I think, is what's valuable there is, I think, what is ultimately what he comes to be, and after his turn, self-critical about, which is that he remains still somewhat invested in a Kantian tradition for which transcendental analysis is a requisite component of a fully worked out philosophical approach, especially when what we're talking about is ourselves as human beings. And that part I am sympathetic towards. And then, to me, part of the issue is, how do you interface that kind of Kantian-inspired transcendental analysis with a broadly speaking, a materialist framework of those aspects of Marxism, right? And so that, to me, is where specifically the early Heidegger and some of what is involved with the early Heidegger's way of distinguishing between history and historicity is of enormous value. But of course, not only for Marxist reasons, but you might say based on a combination of primarily Marxist and psychoanalytic considerations, inflected by things such as, for example, French structuralism and its various permutations. I am adamantly opposed to some of the basic commitments of anybody invested in phenomenology, including Heidegger, in terms of what we are supposed to pay attention to, where the center of gravity is supposed to be, the level of credence given to, for instance, experience as understood phenomenologically versus other dimensions that we might want to bring into play from a more materialist vantage point. And then, of course, I also fully agree with Chris when he said, for all Heidegger's talk about history, he doesn't actually do much of it. There's very little. I mean, it's so, well, first of all, I mean, he speaks in remarkably naive ahistorical terms about phenomena like das Mann as, really recognizable as a more localized historical phenomenon of the denizen of a modern, industrial, bureaucratized capitalist society. And he talks about this as though it's just an eternal human type in a way. It's just one example among many. But then, in addition, when Heidegger talks about history as in terms of like the epochs of the disclosure of being, I mean, you can just read it off from basically the standard history of philosophy canon, where you go down the list, Plato, then Aristotle, et cetera. And and of course, with the idea that the pre-Socratics had this, insight into fundamental ontology that was then covered over by the advent of Western metaphysics with Socrates and Plato, blah, blah, blah. And then it's just this really remarkably story. And sweeping, and so and then on top of it, of course, the Nazism, which, as we know, in recent years, both the Schwarze Heft, the Black Notebooks, as well as the correspondence with his brother, indicates that he was a diehard, committed, fascist anti-Semite long after Hitler's defeat. Even, I mean, it's really appalling So that too, of course, just makes him, toxic in addition to philosophically objectionable. But anyhow, in a nutshell, I would have to say about him, and that is hopefully a clear enough fashion.
In the transcendental sense, an object is outside me when its existence does not depend, even partly, on my representations of it. The empirical sense of outside me depends upon the distinction between outer and inner sense. Inner sense is the sensible intuition of my inner states, which are themselves appearances. Time is the form of inner sense, meaning that all the states we intuit in inner sense are temporally ordered. Outer sense is the sensible intuition of objects that are not my inner states. Space is the form of outer sense. In the empirical sense, outer simply refers to objects of outer sense, objects in space. Transcendental idealism is the view that objects in space are outer in the empirical sense, but not in the transcendental sense. Things in themselves are transcendentally outer, but appearances are not.
I need to see you. Meet me in Fuller's office.
I know the truth.
Where are you?
You could call it the end of the world.
So in very basic terms, Kant and Hegel would not have divided a subjective account of history and an objective account of history. But by the late 19th century, it seems like there's an antinomy between subjective approach to history and objective approach to history. And that's the crisis.
Can I ask you a question? Would it be that the reason why Kant wouldn't divide the subjective account of history from the objective account of history be because Kant put the whole realm of the objective outside of the categories of human understanding? So then any account of history would be subjective? Because he had this realm of the noumenal where, he had a critique of the pure reason. He had he wanted to.
This is a little bit already neo-Kantian, right? So unfortunately, we tend to read Kant through neo-Kantian preoccupations, like a division of the epistemological and the ethical, and this kind of thing. And I kind of feel like in Kant's own terms, this really doesn't make any sense. It's simply the dialectical approach, because Kant is dialectical. He's not antinomical, he's dialectical. And what that means is that you can't understand the object without the subject, and you can't understand the subject without the object, right? And it's just as simple as that, and that doesn't preclude like scientific knowledge, right? In other words, like self-conscious truth, right? Doesn't preclude that. And so again, we tend to sort of turn it into like an epistemological problem, and it really isn't just that. And that's where, again, the sympathetic reading of Heidegger would be, but also I feel like, just to say something about the phenomenological, I feel like poor Husserl, I feel like, Husserl, who's like one of Heidegger's professors, the crisis of the European sciences is like a wonderful kind of registration of a problem, in the early 20th century. So it's not like these problems are unknown, right? It's not like only Marxism sees a problem or something. These problems are evident to everyone, if you will. And so then the question is how to address the problem. And, again, the problem with a kind of materialist historical approach and a kind of mode of production approach and this kind of thing, that actually might presuppose too much. In other words, if we just think, okay, we're going to have like a social historical account, and this is where I'm sympathetic to the idea that we don't want to like be historicist or reduce things to their context, because again, that's very kind of flat. It's kind of like, well, no, what do we even mean by historical context, social context? What do we mean by society? Is society just a set of conventions that people have? No, right? Is history just a point in time? No, right? So again, those fundamental questions, what do we even mean by society, social context? What do we mean by history, historical context at all? And much more widely than Marxism, this problem is registering itself, in like classical sociology, Durkheim and Weber, these questions are being taken up. And so there is like an evident crisis of the meaning of scientific knowledge, for example. And also obviously philosophy has been in crisis. I guess I'll just say from a Marxist perspective, since the young Hegelians, philosophy has been in crisis. And so there have been various responses to that crisis.
Yeah, I mean, for me, from my, again, undergraduate level original training in philosophy, the idea that you seem to be equating Kant and Hegel here when you speak of him this way.
The danger is reducing Kant to Plato, right? Noumena and phenomena. That's not what Kant means. It's just not. And also Humean skepticism is not, like, these are the things that actually Kant is working beyond, right? In other words, he tends to be reduced back to a kind of ancient idealism or a kind of empiricism, again, antinomically. And it's like, well, then you're kind of throwing out all the work that Kant did.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I always deal with this with my students, especially when I teach Lukács, and the thing in itself problem, and the thing, and the noumena, and the phenomena. And it's like, well, actually, this is the dialectic, right? In other words, though, we're not stuck in this antinomy.
Right before I started this stream, I was editing a video. I was actually reposting a video I had edited a long time ago. I'd interviewed Zizek. We talked about the critiques he was getting specifically from Noam Chomsky. And I had noted that Chomsky has said many times that we just don't have a concept of the physical, that there is no concept of the physical left. And he, as a philosopher, he embraces something called Mysterianism or something like that, where the realm of the physical is just always going to be beyond.
Zizek embraces this.
No, Chomsky.
Chomsky. Okay, yeah, Chomsky.
Chomsky embraces this, not Zizek. Okay.
Okay.
And Zizek, as a Hegelian, from the way I'm thinking about this, says, okay, that realm of the mystery, that realm outside of human understanding that we are always going to be cut off from, is already included in our understanding. It is a category of our understanding. That's how I conceived of Zizek's answer to Chomsky, which I thought was not the same as Kant. I thought that was Hegelian. But in any case, does that clarify a difference here between the Zizekian Hegelian approach and...
Maybe I put it this way, Doug, that it's rather than thinking, how do we not know things? We should be thinking, how do we know things?
Okay.
Right? Not as a limit or an incapacity, but as a faculty and a capacity.
Okay. All right.
Because
Adrian, can you I'm hoping, Adrian, you're going to step in and take up my position, but I that's never happened to me in the past, where when I hope that will happen, it invariably what happens is both sides tell me I'm wrong, especially when it was Zizek and Jerry Pinkard. So
that's likely to happen here.
Go ahead. Do you have anything can you help me out?
Well, I mean, of course, it was precisely Kant's notion of das Ding an sich that ended up serving as a lightning rod for a whole series of controversies that became central structuring aspects of the development of post-Kantian idealism. And that, in 1785, when Jacoby triggered these, pantheism / Spinozism controversy, through his anti-Enlightenment polemics, in that context, when he addresses Kant and, of course, takes Kant to be the leading contemporary representative of the Enlightenment tendencies that Jacoby is arguing against, that Jacoby and, of course, overall, Jacoby's way of throwing down the gauntlet here and saying with Kant as the exemplar of a certain kind of secular Enlightenment philosophizing as Jacoby understood it, that Jacoby wants to argue that either you are fully systematic as a philosopher, in which case Jacoby says you inevitably end up being a Spinozist, which for Jacoby means that you are a determinist, hence a fatalist, and hence a nihilist, with Jacoby introducing the very idea of nihilism as a critical term of art in European philosophy that then becomes important for a figure like Heidegger, among others, later. And he says, it's that. So you get, the fatalism and nihilism of systematicity, or you accept that, this newfangled philosophy is not what it's all cracked up to be, and what you need to do instead is accept that, that one has to take certain things on faith, and that there are limits to reason, et cetera, right? And so he basically says you can account for human freedom and everything that goes along with it, or you can have a system. It's one or the other. You have to choose.
That's the antinomy.
Well, that's for Jacoby, the fourth choice that he thinks he can impose on his audience using Kant, and then deploying Spinoza.
Yeah, no, I'm a third critique guy with Kant. And isn't it Jacoby who said Kant is wrong, but then about Hegel, he said Hegel's not even wrong?
Well, what I have in mind, though, is rather
that's important, though. So
yes,
let Adrian get to the end. Yeah, go ahead
if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So that whole you have to choose between freedom or system. Well, you could see all of post-Kantian idealism as represented by the likes of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel as all versions of the effort to refute that and to show that to be a false choice, and to say no, you can have a rigorous philosophical system that not only includes human freedom but is in a way centered or grounded upon it.
Yes,
but what they all agree with Jacoby about is what Jacoby conveys in this very succinct formulation in 1785, where Jacoby says, without Kant's thing in itself, I can't enter into a system, but with Kant's thing in itself, I can't remain within it. And so the idea that, Kant, that the thing in itself was the crystallization of eternal inconsistencies within Kant's position that prevented Kantianism from being deemed fully systematic in a really internally coherent, rigorous fashion, and then prompted all of the post-Kantian idealists to try and overhaul things in light of their development of Jacoby's insight into the contradictions that are condensed in the Kantian thing in itself. And of course, Doug, what you indicated in terms of Zizek's answer is very much in line with that style of post-Kantian idealist criticism of the Kantian thing in itself, and the argument that any effort to draw this kind of limit that Kant seeks to draw in terms of the limits of possible experience, demarcating the boundary between phenomenal objects as appearances and noumenal things in themselves, with the latter as inherently inaccessible, forever withdrawn, etc. That, of course, Hegel's eminent critical work on the very, categories that Kant's relying on, including concepts involving limit, etc., is designed to show that you are never entitled to the kind of crude two-world metaphysics that is usually deployed in Kant's name, according to which you have this split. Right.
No, I would just say, I'll just full disclosure, I'm a student of Pippin, Robert Pippin. And, and I'll just say Zizek, I think on occasion says he's not really Hegelian, he's a follower of Schelling, which I think we have to pay attention to. And so what Pippin does, Pippin's been accused of assimilating Hegel back to Kant. But what Pippin does in his scholarship is emphasize how Hegel's building upon the third critique, the critique of judgment, rather than staying in the ambit of the first critique. And Jacoby's, criticism of Kant is a criticism of the first critique. And Kant had not finished out his philosophical system. So what we're talking about there is just the realm of epistemology, just the realm of the understanding. And that is not the full scope of reason or even of cognition, right? That practical reason and judgment are not included in the first critique. I mean, their places relative to the first critique are indicated there, but they're not really fleshed out. And so, we act, and we act morally, we act socially, not simply on the basis of understanding, not simply on the basis of concepts or theories. There is practical reason that's not reducible to the understanding. And there's also judgment. There's aesthetic judgment. There's the imagination, which is a cognitive faculty, and he says is the cognitive faculty of freedom that is neither reducible to either our understanding or our practical reason. So practical reason is not reducible to understanding, and our judgment, our highest faculty, and the faculty of our freedom is not reducible to either theory or practice, either concepts, understanding, or practical reason. So that part gets left out. And again, I've mentioned this with the Neo-Kantians, what you get, and again, the Frankfurt School would understand this as a phenomenon of capitalism, the division between ethics and epistemology.
I want to clarify what I think, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong here, but what is at stake in this? What is so far been, I think, as it goes along, more and more clear of a difference of opinion, but it's not entirely clear right yet where the difference lies. But that's normal, because when people disagree, they constantly also fight over what the terms are of what they're disagreeing about. But and try to and everyone wants to, but what I see is at stake here is how do we avoid a kind of what Lukács might call a kind of reification,
Right.
or a taking. Where do we decide? What do we decide is human nature, transhistorical, etc., and what do we decide is historical, and how? And then how do we do it? And like Chris, when you were just describing your approach to Kantianism through the critique of judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look, as someone who is not a scholar, not an academic, it sounded to me like it vibed along with how I understand Heidegger, which is like Heidegger is someone who wants to be able to step outside of the antimonies that arise through reason, the difficulties that might arise when we try to systematize and have clear understanding, and have some recourse to a realm of knowledge that, and from my way of thinking, is mystified, and which cannot be,
right?
which can't be, you'll never resolve it.
Self-consciousness of freedom. I mean, I would just say this about Kant and the transhistorical and the historical, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Which is all humans who have ever lived in culture, all humans for which we have any kind of record of their lives, seem to have expressed cognition of the true, the good, and the beautiful. In other words, every human community, all humans ever have had notions of truth, epistemological knowledge, certainty, moral goodness, and also aesthetic beauty, aesthetic feeling and aesthetic imagination. That has been exhibited in all human cultures ever. And yet, across history, you have wildly varying notions of all three of those things. So the truth remains true, even though it changes historically. The good remains, in other words, once you recognize history, that doesn't mean that you're in this relativistic realm in which there's no truth, there's no morality, and there's no aesthetic criteria of judgment. What it means is that these things are, I guess, invariant, but highly variable. In other words, all human communities, all cultures have always ever had these values, and yet how they define those values and even the substance of those values actually has changed radically and even reversed themselves entirely across history. Right? So we live in truths today that ancients would have regarded as not true. We live in morality that the ancients would have considered not morality. We appreciate aesthetic things at the level of feeling and intuitive judgment that they would not have appreciated, that they would not have valued, right? And so again, that's where, because otherwise we might end up in a realm where Kant's ahistorical, Hegel's historical, or the standard accounts, which I think are just a problem. The stakes for me and how it relates back to the question of Freud,
I was just going to say, I want to hear from both of you what the stakes are.
The stakes are bourgeois subjectivity. In other words, the reality of bourgeois subjectivity, the substance of bourgeois subjectivity, the substance of freedom. In other words, that I'm concerned that, certainly my education was deconstructing the bourgeois subject, right? In other words, showing its invalidity. Well, actually, what about its validity? What about its substance? What about, because I really don't think we're going to do politically what we need to do if we junk bourgeois subjectivity. And
okay.
I heard Adrian earlier saying we don't want to throw out the transcendental categories. The way I understand that is we don't want to throw out the bourgeois subject.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, Adrian,
right? We don't have anything else.
I've always understood Zizek to be standing up in defense of some form of bourgeois norms. And I didn't think of it that way in those terms when I first heard him, but he was always standing up for some sort of return to sense, I thought. He was a critic of post-structuralism.
Recognizing the substance, which is not the same thing as being normative, by the way.
So, right. But Adrian, do you feel as though, like, to the extent that there's a conflict between someone like Chris, who wants to hold on to, like, realize in the sort of traditional Marxist way, realize the bourgeois subjectivity rather than abolish it. Do you think that your understanding of Zizek and Lacan would be part of that project, or where do you see the stakes in this conversation so far?
Well, I mean, for me, just at the biggest picture level, it's not about, well, a lot would hinge on what we understand as being involved in terms of the further actualization of the bourgeois subject. And if that is just a certain way of articulating the classical Marxist notion, according to which one of the things that differentiates a Marxist conception of socialism and communism from, similar but, notably quite different orientations and agendas on the radical left, both then and now, is that, for Marx, and this also differentiates, Marx from someone like Heidegger. When you look at, for instance, how Marx and Heidegger approach technology and its relation to, particular, socio-historical contexts, et cetera, you see some of this come out. But, in classical Marxism already, there's the idea that socialism and communism will carry forward and further develop things which we can genuinely not in an insincere or tongue-in-cheek fashion, but genuinely, sincerely, thank capitalism for. That there are a number of, scientific, technological, and sociocultural developments associated with the history of capitalism that for Marx are, of course, themselves important precursor ingredients or conditions of possibility for the surpassing of capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. And so if it's something in that vein, well, I think we all agree at that broad level. Right. Mm-hmm. But then if we're going to talk about this in terms of, thinking about the bourgeois subject, as I think of it, when we use this precise phrasing, really more as a certain, model of the human agent that's very much bound up with certain forms of primarily, early modern British liberal individualism. The kind of individualistic ethos, and that, of course, Hegel gets at when Hegel talks about the emergence of modern moralität as coming into a certain type of set of conflicts with, various versions of Sittlichkeit, and that, if we take that, and both Hegel and Marx here, I think, would say, that the kind of bourgeois individualism that is really very part and parcel of how we are all subjectivized and how we all spontaneously think of ourselves in our daily lives under capitalism. That for me, I still do remain wedded to the project of deconstructing the bourgeois subject in the sense of this idea of the individual as, an agent, operating according to rational choice or, other game theoretic, style paradigms, just simply confronting, other agents and objects in marketplaces or marketplace-like settings and interacting with them in a transactional fashion, et cetera. I mean, at the root of this is really an ancient, conflict between, partisans of this view, according to which, and here I would use Hobbes as almost the paradigm figure, right? The notion that primordially we are first and foremost islands unto ourselves, or self-enclosed windowless monads, if you want to use Leibnizian language to describe it. And then of course, Hobbes, using Plautus and saying man is a wolf to man, right? So the lone wolf model, that first we are these atomic individuals, and then we only secondarily enter into social relations as an add-on, through the myth of the transition, to civilization via the social contract and exiting the supposed state of nature. So you have that model, and then you have the tradition that I think the biggest, most important representatives of in Western philosophical history are Aristotle, Hegel, and Marx, who all subscribe to Aristotle's Zoon Politikon model, according to which you are political qua, social cultural, etc. beings.
First.
We are inherently gregarious animals first, right? That is our first nature, right? And, to me, a contemporary defense of the Zoon Politikon orientation against bourgeois individualism, that has enormous implications on various levels, including, I think, at a very practical, concrete political level.
I am not a number. I am a person.
Have it your way. Have it your way. Have it your way at Burger King.
May I help you, sir?
2 Whoppers, 2 Whopper Juniors, and 4 Coca-Cola. And would I have to wait long if you made 1 Whopper with no pickle and no lettuce?
No, sir. Hold the pickle, hold the lettuce. Special orders don't upset us. All we ask is that you let us serve it your way.
Have it your way. Have it your way at Burger King. At Burger King.
Bourgeois thought, historically bourgeois thought, Locke and Rousseau as opposed to Hobbes. I mean, Hobbes was a thinker of the counter-revolution, meaning he wants to say, you need a sovereign, a strong sovereign to keep the peace among warring individuals. Locke and Rousseau say no, right? Mm-hmm. And I do think that Marx and Kant and Hegel are coming from Locke and Rousseau, not Hobbes. And so individuality versus individualism, collectivity versus collectivism. In other words, not the fact that we experience in capitalism this antinomy between individualism and collectivism, and that we've lost the dialectical interplay of the individual and the collective. That is a historical achievement of bourgeois society, right? Yeah. And we seem to be faced with a choice. Am I going to submit to the collective, or am I going to be like an anarchistic, libertarian, lone wolf individual? Those are reifications. And, they exist, that reification, that split, that antinomy happened for real historical and social reasons. But nonetheless, it's a contradiction. It's a kind of, the collectivism contradicts the true nature and potential of the collectivity. And individualism contradicts the true potential and substance of individuality, right? So the individual as produced by social history nonetheless is real. And of course, politically, we can only appeal to individuals. We can only speak as individuals. We can only appeal to individuals. We can't tell people submit to the collective. I mean, we know what happens with that. And original Marxism appealed to individuals, right? Lenin didn't say, abandon your individual thinking. He appealed to people's individual reason.
Διότι βεβαίως εάν κανείς είναι μαρξιστής, θα πει ότι ο τρόπος παραγωγής σε αυτές τις κοινωνίες είναι καπιταλιστικός. Έτσι. Συνεπώς αυτές οι κοινωνίες είναι καπιταλιστικές από το α ως το ω, διότι ο τρόπος παραγωγής καθορίζεται πάντα. Οι κοινωνίες όμως αυτές δεν είναι απλώς καπιταλιστικές. Αυτοονομάζονται δημοκρατικές. Εγώ δεν τις ονομάζω δημοκρατικές γιατί έχω άλλη γνώμη περί δημοκρατίας και δίνω άλλο περιεχόμενο στην όρο δημοκρατίας. Τις ονομάζω φιλελεύθερες ολιγαρχίες. Αλλά υπάρχει ασφαλώς μέσα σε αυτές τις κοινωνίες ένα δημοκρατικό στοιχείο. Αυτό το δημοκρατικό στοιχείο υπάρχει, δημιουργήθηκε, δεν έπεσε από τον ουρανό και δεν δημιουργήθηκε από τον καπιταλισμό. Δημιουργήθηκε σε αντίθεση με τον καπιταλισμό. Δημιουργήθηκε στην αρχή στις πρώτες πόλεις της Δυτικής Ευρώπης που βγαίνουν από τον Μεσαίωνα και όπου οι πρώτοι λεγόμενοι αστεί, που δεν έχουν καμία σχέση με τους κεφαλοκράτες ή τους καπιταλιστές τους μετά, μαζεύονται και προσπαθούν να αυτοκυβερνηθούν και να αποκτήσουν μια σχετική αυτονομία σε σχέση με την εκκλησία, τους βασιλιάδες, τους φεουδάρχες κτλ. Συνεχίζεται αυτό με όλο το κίνημα που γίνεται με την Αναγέννηση και μετά με την Αγγλική Επανάσταση του 17ου αιώνα και τη Γαλλική και την Αμερικάνικη Επανάσταση του 18ου αιώνα, και αυτού του κινήματος του δημοκρατικού κληρονόμος είναι ασφαλώς το εργατικό κίνημα και τα νεότερα κινήματα τα οποία ήρθανε μετά. Έτσι. Από όλη αυτή την ιστορία υπάρχουν βαθύτατα κατάλοιπα μέσα σε αυτές τις κοινωνίες. Και αυτά τα κατάλοιπα είναι αυτά τα οποία σήμερα μας επιτρέπουν εδώ, παραδείγματι, να μιλάμε και να λέμε αυτά τα οποία λέμε. Και αυτά δεν υπάρχουν από την άλλη μεριά. Και αυτά τα κατάλοιπα που υπάρχουν δεν υπάρχουν ελαίο καπιταλισμού, αλλά υπήρξαν, δημιουργήθηκαν και υπάρχουν επειδή οι άνθρωποι και το 19ο αιώνα ασφαλώς, κατά κύριο λόγο, η εργατική τάξη και ο λαός γενικότερα, αγωνίστηκαν για να αποκτήσουν αυτά τα δικαιώματα, αυτές τις ελευθερίες κτλ. Έτσι. Συνεπώς, το να βάλει κανείς στον ίδιο παρονομαστή το ρωσικό καθεστώς το σημερινό και τα δυτικά καθεστώτα της σήμερα, ή μάλλον τις κοινωνίες, σαν σύνολα ανθρώπων με θεσμούς, με συνήθειες, με ανακλαστικές κινήσεις, αυτό που μπορεί να συμβεί στο Παρίσι ή και στην Αθήνα σήμερα και που είναι αδιανόητο στη Ρωσία, δηλαδή να κάνει κάποιος αστυνομικός κάτι παραπάνω μες στον δρόμο και να επεμβούν τρεις πολίτες που πούνε τι κάνεις, θα σου πάρω τον αριθμό σου. Αυτό που είναι αδιανόητο στη Ρωσία. Αυτό δεν δημιουργείται ούτε σε μία μέρα ούτε σε ένα χρόνο. Είναι θέμα γενεών ολοκληρών και εμείς οι Έλληνες με τη ραγιά δική μας κληρονομιά πρέπει να το ξέρουμε αυτό το πράγμα. Λοιπόν, αυτή η διαφορά είναι απολύτως ουσιαστική, αλλά και αυτή ακόμα η διαφορά δεν φτάνει για να μας κάνει να αποφασίσουμε μια πολιτική στάση απέναντι σε αυτόν τον ανταγωνισμό. Θέλω να πω δηλαδή ότι δεδομένου ότι σε αυτές τις φιλελεύθερες ολιγαρχίες τα καθεστώτα που υπάρχουν είναι αυτά τα οποία είναι, δεδομένης της πολιτικής τις οποίες ακολουθούν, δεν είναι δυνατό ποτέ κανείς να πει εγώ προτείνω να αντισταθούμε στο ρωσικό ιμπεριαλισμό, στη ρωσική στρατοκρατία, συμμαχών.
I saw an interview with Cornelius Castriatus later in his life, and he was someone who was a Marxist, a kind of a post-Trotskyist or something. He did created a journal called Socialism or Barbarism. That was psychoanalytic. There was
he was a Lacanian too.
No, no. He worked with Laplanche, who was a student of Lacan, but he was not
the social imaginary.
Yeah,
is Lacanian.
I don't know, but Laplanche certainly was, and he was another editor at on the Socialism or Barbarism. But the point is this: Cornelius was saying, and this is after he's left Marxism behind.
Right.
He's saying, look, the kind of autonomy that I want to see in society, the kind of people who want to be autonomous are rare. They're historical. They came up for a little while and they've been smashed. That's been done. That's been killed off. And I don't know what use there is of it for autonomy anymore. He was defeated, but he was saying,
that's an abdication, of course. That's that is the defeat. And
right, but look, but the point is, he was saying the autonomous individual is an achievement, of history rather than a starting point. So rather than all of us being lone wolves fighting for ourselves, we are in a society which gives us the freedom.
Gives us scope for the individual.
That's what Cornelius thought.
Obviously,
and he thought we'd lost that. And frankly, I think we've lost it. Right now,
certainly has been undermined by capitalism.
Yeah,
but we are still speaking for ourselves to each other. We are.
That's true. Yeah,
we're not just language machines. We're not just meme factories. We're not. I'm sorry. I'm not.
Right.
And that's not an illusion. That's not.
I have to recharge my battery. Just one moment. Go ahead, and hook my brain into the internet. Go ahead, Adrian.
Just a brief aside. So Laplanche, by the time of the mid-1960s, had fallen out with Lacan. And so the Laplanche who Castoriadis would have had a relationship with already considered himself, in a way, an ex-Lacanian dissident. Now, admittedly, there are aspects of Laplanche's work that remain indebted to Lacan despite his sense of rupture with him. And then Castoriadis, one has to bear in mind, he was affiliated he was involved with what's called the fourth group, which was an analytic orientation that was formed by people who had deliberately left Lacan's École Freudienne to set themselves up as another dissident group. And so with both of them, it's really, yes, they use some Lacanian language, but let's be careful. Neither of them considered themselves to be Lacanians, and in fact had a marked distaste, at least for aspects of Lacanianism, and particularly its institutional form. But I just wanted to,
I'll be forthright about the very crude way that I tend to think about these things, which is I think that Freud is about strengthening the ego and, you know, helping people overcome their involuntary conflict with their conscious will, and that Lacan is saying that there's a futility to that. In other words, that and I think that if we embrace the futility of it, then we basically might as well check out of politics and just become pre-Socratic.
No, respond, because this is this is essential.
No, I mean, this is too broad. I just want to say I think that's dead wrong, and is just all I can say is go read Lacan. Because
no, but let Adrian go ahead. Adrian.
No, but of course, and with Freud himself, you know, that the idea that he wants to strengthen the ego is based on a certain interpretation of this famous sentence from the 1933 New Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, where in German Freud says "Wo es war, soll ich werden." And that this gets worked up into English and French translations at the hands of, in France, Marie Bonaparte, and then Strachey and company on the English side of things. That they insist on wording it essentially as, where id was, there must ego come to be, which is then interpreted as, all right, the ego needs to displace the id or strengthen itself and lord it over the id, etc. And bear in mind that Freud, when he the terms that are being mistranslated as id and ego there,
right.
when Freud uses when Freud uses them in the technical sense of, two of the three agencies of his second topography, he always uses the definite article, right? Das es, das ich. But he doesn't in that sentence, right? So he's not, indicating that these are the agencies of the topography, that's been put in place and starting in 1923 in the ego and the id. And so it's where it was, there must I come to be, which is very different. That's about, the way I like to describe it to my students is, all right, a standard conception of psychoanalysis on the side of people who are potential or beginning analysans is that, okay, it's like I've got this, my car is covered in bird shit. And I really am tired of all the bird shit caked all over it. I'm going to drive it through a car wash at long last, and it's going to come out the other side looking all nice and clean. And they think of the analysis as basically the extended car wash. And that my point is, what analysis does is when you come out the other end of the car wash, you go from before, I want to get the bird shit off my car, to when you come out the other side, you go, my God, I just realized my car is made of bird shit. Without the bird shit, there'd be no car. I couldn't go anywhere, right? I wouldn't be able to drive, right? And the idea of being able to turn things that you want to hold at arm's length, whether through repression or other mechanisms, that you disidentify with and want to attribute to, well, that's just this, external contingency. It belongs to this it. I don't identify with it. There's my I here. There's the it there. And, where it was, there must I come to be. There I have to recognize that I have to. Yes, and that there are transformative effects that can arise from that. And I think that that's what someone like Lacan is after. I mean, he even says at the end of the famous version of the Mirror Stage, the 1949 écrit of that title, says, that we lead the patient to the part of the thou art that, which tu es cela. And it means both, there's that accretion of things that you now have to realize you have identified with and make up part of your being, but also you gain a certain distance once you can identify it, and hence the homophony in French with tu es cela also could be heard as kill that, right? Or, basically, you actually do achieve a certain relief through distantiation, through that very gesture of identification. And that, I mean, just in a nutshell is what, and of course, Lacan, I think, rightly points out, if what Freud was saying is that you want to strengthen the ego to tame the unruly id, then there's nothing really revolutionary in Freud's thinking. This is just very much in line with a well-worn, almost cliche narrative, which goes back to the ancient Greeks. I mean, you find Plato talking these ways, etc. And if Freud really is, in certain ways, a remarkably unprecedented figure, this is part of it, is that he doesn't subscribe, I think, to that sort of
I would put
image.
the strengthening of the ego as the strengthening of the reality principle. And that means having a realistic view of oneself as well, right? In other words, it's not about the victory of the ego over the id. It's rather overcoming the conflict between ego and id that had manifested in the neurosis. meaning, it's not about doing away with repression or fully repressing. It's neither like getting rid of repression, nor is it the full victory of repression. It's rather that repression is sublimation. In other words, that you can recognize yourself and sort of be yourself, right? That it's not about like one or the other. And my fear, because I would also say that I'm always interested in saving the original thinker from the followers. So I am interested in saving Lacan from the Lacanians to a certain extent. And Lacanians not in the sense of professional Lacanians, but in the sense of pop Lacanianism, the Lacanism that I live and breathe in academia. And that tends to be about, that your ego is an illusion. Kill the ego. It's about ego death, as my students put it. Well, what about ego death? And I'm like, no one's interested in that, children.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Zizek is opposed to that too.
You might say that for Lacan, it's more, I think, closer to when a doctor has to re-break a bone to get it to set right. And that for Lacan, I think there is having to pass through this moment of ego death. I mean, he even, he himself says in places such as, and here's where you have, Lacan was Heideggerian in some ways in the 1950s, but he has a falling out with him. And I think he really becomes genuinely, wholeheartedly, vehemently opposed to Heidegger at a very fundamental level, really in terms of ontology itself, by the 1970s, where he starts in seminars from the early 70s making very pointed criticisms directed at Heidegger's notion of fundamental ontology and ontological difference without naming Heidegger as such, so it's clear who it is.
Right.
But anyhow, at an earlier Lacan, in the seventh seminar, in a more Heideggerian moment, he does talk about this need to pass through aspects of what is involved in Heidegger's description of being towards death as an element of the terminal phase of an analytic process. And, and this, of course, is that sense of, all right, in terms of my identity, Heidegger's insistence on the inescapable ownmost quality of one's own mortal finitude, a la being towards death. There it's like, okay, this is most you, but not in the ego level sense of here's my stable self and this representation that I have that I and others, can relate to as an imaginary symbolic construction, etc. But rather that singularity of, there is no cure for mortality. The analyst can't pull that out of his back pocket. Right. So, you really have to, and dealing with everything that brings with it and going through this experience of a kind of ego death at the end of analysis. But for Lacan, the end of analysis is not the end full stop, right? No. Because he even says in the mirror stage essay too, at the end, it's not in our, beyond the thou art that / kill that. He says what happens on the other side of that, that is going to be left up to the analysand, and they have to be allowed to live on the other side of that. Right. And Lacan clearly thinks that, egos and other things will reconstitute themselves on the other side of that. But in having broken the old ego in a certain way, it is able to reconfigure itself differently after passing through that ordeal of the termination of analysis as Lacan describes it. And then also with the reality principle issue, well, we're going back to Freud, right? Now, I think Freud, in the last years of his life, I think there was an unfortunate influence on his thinking coming from his daughter, Anna Freud. And that, she publishes in 1933, what really is kind of the foundational text for the entire ego psychology movement, that then, of course, becomes Lacan's main opponent within the international psychoanalytic community. And, it's entitled, of course, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, with Lacan's rebuttal essentially being, no, the ego is the mechanisms of defense. Of course, it's not distinguishable from them. Right. But Freud, I think, too, he, as the founder of analytic technique, including its very hands-off sort of approach, I don't think he saw himself as in the business of, at least before his thinking became at least a little contaminated by the original impetuses behind ego psychology, which I think that idea of analysis as forcing you to adjust to basically a socially defined reality principle. That's I don't think that's either Freud or Lacan, but that is certainly Hartman, Chris, and Lowenstein.
There's reality principle and there's reality principle, meaning I agree that Freud is not about adjusting people to social norms or something, but we still have to live in society, In other words, we still have to be able to negotiate it. And I'm just saying that people run with Lacan, and the way they interpret ego death is some kind of like fundamental psychosis or something. And it's like, no, we're not talking about that, other than in the ordinary sense that, of course, there's a sort of dissociative aspect to psychology, that's just there. But, we're not saying, the cure to the bourgeois subject is psychosis.
No.
And
Lacan is not Deleuze and Guattari. That's basically what confused Lacan with Deleuze and Guattari.
Thank you.
He's not.
Yeah,
Thank
right.
you. That is maybe my most basic, crudest point. Right.
And I agree with that. I mean, that's not Lacan for me either at all. That is
right.
Yeah,
and I think it's worth pointing out that when Zizek wrote in 1989 was it the ticklish subject that was
Sublime Object? Sublime Object was 89.
Yeah,
Ticklish
Sublime
Subject
Object
was 99.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So it was the Sublime Object of Ideology. But that book, if I remember correctly, arrived on the scene as just a wrecking ball to post-structuralism. It was just and it was, I think, received by those who call themselves post-structuralists and who would side with Deleuze. It was conceived of and received as a conservative kind of attack. But in fact, it was simply an attempt to return to some kind of subjectivity where we would have a chance to stand up to the society as it was. And so that's how I see Zizek as an ally in that. Go ahead.
Yeah, and along these lines, and this allows me to also link back to some of what we were talking about in connection with, like Doug, I think a little while ago you asked about, the later phases of the Frankfurt School, like second and third generation Frankfurt School, over and above our, both Chris and I tending to have targeted our remarks about the Frankfurt School to its first generation. And another thing to appreciate about, Zizek, especially in terms of his early texts like Sublime Object, is that he was also very much involved in not only, I think, pushing back against post-structuralism, but also against second and third generation Frankfurt School. And of course, part of what the Sublime Object did, I think, is to, re-actualize as contemporarily crucial Marxist ideology critique of a sort that, it was viewed as really passé and, historically moribund by not just some post-structuralists, but some very much associated with later phases of the Frankfurt School. And, what I think Zizek's work helped bring out in part is that, for me, figures like Habermas and Hanek are no longer Marxists. I mean, what they really are doing is they are essentially, center-left partisans of bourgeois modernity who are relying on the faint whiff of radicalism from the lingering fumes from the earlier pioneering days of the Frankfurt School. And that, to me, they just essentially trot out what could come from the British Labour Party or sections of the America's Democratic National Committee, just these center-left bourgeois bromides dressed up in technical terminology. I don't mean to be harsh, but I just think, and to understand that in a way that isn't just dismissive, is that one has to realize, okay, the second and third generation of the Frankfurt School were their work makes sense when what you are thinking about are issues having to do with the aftermath of really existing socialism, the reunification of Germany, and how to negotiate that situation in the late 20th century. And if that is your overriding concern, they make much more sense, but that, we can see them then as really too bound to that context to be really useful at a larger level. And I think that Zizek also was very effective as a critic of them beginning in his early work. And then, of course, earned him charges of, left fascism, etc. And this is, of course, part of what's involved, too, in his insistence on not just a return to the likes of, Hegel, Marx, and Lacan, but also to Lenin, right? And all of what's involved there. And that, of course, brings him into debates, too, with the post-Marxist strands of structuralism and post-structuralism as well, including figures like Castoriadis, Leclau, Mouffe, etc.
Yeah, if I could say something about, I guess, again, the historical argument, right, and the issue of ideology critique, right? Because I think that my own interest in the Frankfurt School is very much about ideology critique in this sense. In other words, that we work through manifest phenomena of ideology rather than, the Hegel phrase, the substance or the essence must appear, right? Everything takes a form of appearance, that it's not like you're getting at an underlying essence and despite the appearance, but the appearance itself has a substance. And the appearance of things has the substance of freedom, meaning it presents itself as like a task, the way the world appears to us. So ideology critique in that dialectical sense of dealing with the way things actually appear to us, that's very vital to the way I understand Marxism. And what that allows for is recognizing the bourgeois ideological basis of socialism, but dealing with that in a dialectical way, meaning that the working class is either going to achieve socialism or not achieve socialism based on claiming their bourgeois rights, the bourgeois right of labor, right? And that's both individual and collective in character. That again, it's that this is the way we're going to work through this, even though capitalism has undermined it and in some ways surpassed it, but again, surpassed it in a way that seems only deleterious. That seems like the advance of the inhuman rather than, the fulfillment of a kind of bourgeois humanistic project. And again, this is why we get in Marxism a kind of anti-humanist versus humanist like debate within Marxism, that this is all explicable when we think about it at the level of ideology. And that Marxism is not free of that. It's not like, okay, we found the method to be free of ideology, but rather, how are we going to work in and through ideology?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There's a beautiful illustration of this in terms of Marx's relationship to Darwin. And that, of course, as we all know, Marx wanted to dedicate Volume 1 of Capital to Darwin.
Mm-hmm.
And that, when my students hear details like this, it's often I find they get alarmed initially because when they think about Darwin in connection with anything having to do with politics, they think about the awfulness of things like social Darwinism, et cetera, right? And then having to explain to them, okay, what was it that, really drew Marx and along with him Engels to Darwin, and where were their differences, et cetera. And one thing in terms of Marx's stance vis-a-vis Darwin that I think nicely brings out what Chris was saying about you to work in and through ideology is that, Marx, on the one hand, would say that, well, Darwin's vision of evolution as involving nature, red and tooth and claw, et cetera, is a projection onto the pre and non-human world of, social relations characteristic of, early industrial Dickensian England.
Yep.
But at the same time, instead of that ideological projection blocking Darwin from being able to formulate a new science in the guise of evolutionary biology, it actually weirdly facilitates him hitting certain nails on the head.
That's
right. And so this, in terms of, say like, a standard ideology science distinction, and,
right.
even though we often associate this with Althusser, he's much more subtle in his own handling of it. We could say that, yeah, I mean, Marx himself, especially I think through his appropriately dialectically ambivalent attitude towards Darwin, basically concedes as much in that case and says it's precisely thanks to projecting Dickensian England social relations onto nature that we actually made some real discoveries about how nature works, weirdly enough.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I did a deep dive into Auguste Comte last summer. And I've taught like one little piece by Comte in like a grad methodologies course. And I was always struck by the way Comte connects politics and science. And again, the idea, and then when I did the deep dive, where Comte has this idea that like complex social relations allows for a more complex view of nature. Right. And in other words, it's not the positivism that we know from the 20th century, but rather that, that yes, our knowledge is bound to our social relations, but again, that actually enables, it doesn't only blind, right? And that a critical attitude towards that. In other words, understanding that the social relations are not only simply what exists, but also what we might be tasked to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so again, the substance. Mm-hmm.
And then, this is all, of course, in line with what Marx is getting at when speaking of the history of economic thinking. He famously declares in the introduction to the Grundrisse manuscripts, the anatomy of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape, right?
Exactly.
And it's that, yes, there's this benefit of hindsight, good old Hegelian Al of Minerva style, retroactive discernment of what was there, but could not come to light as such. Unless and until we've reached a certain subsequent level of social complexity to permit that retroactive benefit of hindsight discernment.
Right.
So I'm hearing more agreement here. It's always so frustrating when I get people together to fight and they end up agreeing. No, it's good. Then maybe I anticipated. I do want to ask one last question, and then maybe we can wrap it up. But the distinction between the anti-humanist line and the humanist line, I know that Lacan and Zizek tends to be classified as anti-humanist, but I just wonder, what does that mean?
Right.
And what humanism are we anti, or what humanism are we trying to champion? And it sounds like, if I'm remembering the conversation up to now correctly, sounds like categorizing just what it is to be human is what sort of not only is being contested in philosophical debate, but what we're trying to politically decide. So anyway, so Adrian, how do you see anti-humanism?
Well, here I would want to distinguish between what I think humanism actually is versus how it's referred to especially in the 20th century, primarily French humanism versus anti-humanism debates. And of course, the very founding text of Renaissance humanism is Pico della Mirandola's 1486 oration, Ode to the Dignity of Man. And what's curious about this text is that, in terms of humanism, is involving this idea of a human nature that then one in a sense kind of codifies and presents philosophically or theoretically. But with Pico della Mirandola, it's the narrative according to which, well, the peculiar thing about us is that yes, we have a nature, but it's a nature devoid of any substance. That really what we, and of course, Pico della Mirandola sees this as a divine gift that our benevolent creator bestowed upon us nothing, gave all non-human animals plenty by way of hardwired instincts, natural means of attack and defense, etc. But we humans, and of course there's a version of this in the creation myth in Plato's Protagoras dialogue already, but Mirandola really puts this forward. And then the idea is that what is distinctive about human nature is that we are naturally inclined to the predominance of nurture over nature, as it were. Right. And so this kind of like spontaneous dialectical sensibility, I think, is really built into the foundations of classical humanism, if we indeed, in line with, I think, consensus, treat 1486's Ode to the Dignity of Man as the founding text. And what's curious is that by the time we get to 20th century debates about humanism, it just seems to be as, all right, you have some positive substantialist account of human nature, blah blah blah, but that certainly is antithetical to precisely what the origins of humanism. The other point, though, is that we have to remember the debates within 20th century Marxist circles and their fellow travelers about humanism very much were bound up with, again, Stalinism and with the manner in which people started to turn to, especially the young Marx, and particularly the author of the 1844 Paris Economic and Philosophical manuscripts, as Marx prior to what seemed like, and especially thanks to Stalin's appropriation of it, the cold, inhuman, deterministic machinery of the Marx's, scientific socialist critique of political economy, and that you can find a warmer, fuzzier, more compatible with things like phenomenology, existentialism, etc. Marx in the pre-1845 writings. And I think in this context, even though there are problems with how Althusser intervenes, it's very understandable, I think, why he felt compelled to say, for any number of reasons, this is a very problematic way of relating to Marx and Marxism that also has, in Althusser's view, and I think rightly, not only problematic intellectual consequences, but is also going to be politically disastrous, and is just going to lead to, this kind of tepid capitulationist reformism, and essentially what was derided, in the Marxist tradition as mere legal Marxism, etc. Essentially co-option by parliamentary politics and business as usual.
Right. So again, bourgeois humanism having become reified in capitalism. And reified in capitalism in such a way as to generate discontents with it that in fact tend in this kind of, anti-humanist direction. And, I would, not to demonize poor Heidegger, but Heidegger is the source of this kind of anti-humanism for a lot of 20th century thought. But there are parallel developments like structuralism. And so there's a kind of confluence, if you will, that I would simply say is, a symptom of the crisis of bourgeois subjectivity. That we seem to have a kind of hollowed out version of the bourgeois subject, that humanism seems to be a kind of just so story, that even freedom is reified in this respect. And so, but of course, the actual gutting of the true spirit of bourgeois humanism itself must be explained. It's not just like a kind of misunderstanding or a mistake. It is a kind of manifest apparent reality. It seems that capitalism does demand that we abandon our humanism, right? That we demand, and so how do we make sense of that? Also, how do we treat that as not just a sort of dead end, right? As a kind of baleful dead end? How do we not just mourn the death of the bourgeois subject, and rather see it as, well, this is the way the task of historical transformation is presenting itself to us. It's presenting us with this contradiction of bourgeois humanism seemingly becoming a just so story and a reification of even freedom itself, versus embracing the inhumanity of capital and its demands, right? And that it's, neither and both, to be dialectical about it, right? That struggling for socialism is going to seem to be the restoration of bourgeois humanism and the advancing of inhumanity, right? It's going to seem to be the fulfillment of capitalism's negation of the bourgeois subject, as well as the fulfillment of the potentiality and promise of the bourgeois subject. It's going to appear.
Well, I wish I knew what that meant, Chris. I feel like.
Let me take a stab at answering you right now, Doug, on Chris's behalf.
Okay.
One thing that is really interesting to do is, I have with a number of graduate students working on Marx, done close guided readings with them through, some of Marx's key sources, including things like Smith's Wealth of Nations and Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And for instance, when reading Smith, is always for them very eye-opening, because what you actually realize is that many of Smith's harsh critiques of mercantile economics, you realize are remarkably prescient critiques of what have been more recent developments in really existing capitalism. And that Smith actually has all of these pointed criticisms of things that we now very much associate with capitalism at its most ruthless and rapacious, from an author who is usually held up as, here's one of the great intellectual godfathers of pro-capitalist bourgeois ideology. No, right? I mean, you go back and read him, and he's saying things that you would expect to find from the pen of someone like Marx. And of course, with this idea that he has of, the laissez-faire alternative here would be different than the mercantile one. But of course, that kind of laissez-faire capitalism really never existed. And moreover, we've gone a far distance from the heyday of early industrial local market competition to what we have now in monopoly and post-monopoly capitalism. Or not really post, but just rather its continuation that led some people to say, oh, we're now in neo-feudalism. But anyhow,
it's just monopoly capitalism. That's right.
Yeah. Anyhow.
Yeah, we've been talking about neo-feudalism for a month, and I keep saying basically that. It's monopoly capitalism. It's monopoly capitalism.
Yeah.
Let me tell you why I reacted the way I did to what Chris said, because when he talks about bourgeois rights, there's one right that I have in mind right now, because I'm on some sort of obsessive tear, which is the right to free speech. Because I just discovered in the last month or so just how deeply the state, and not just the United States, but really around the world, the security states around the world have embedded themselves into media, not just social media, not just online, but all across the corporate media. And that I've also discovered by reading reports from Matt Taibbi and then reading documents from NGOs and government websites, that this is a couched as a war on disinformation, and the aim is to go further. The aim is to embed the security state into all the media apparatus around the world even further. That means, and what's weird is like it's not about West versus East. It's happening in the East. It's happening in the West. It's happening it seems to be happening everywhere where there's enough development for there to be a media apparatus. This is going on. So and I think, okay, well, we have to stand up.
You know what I was watching, Doug?
Rights.
I was watching a House committee hearing where it was a clip from Forbes, and it was Marjorie Taylor Greene responding to Donald Payne, I think his name is. He's a congressional representative, and they were basically doing some oversight legislation on the Department of Homeland Security and on the Border Patrol. And it was about like some people in or around the Border Patrol had generated a kind of an emblem celebrating the whipping of the Haitians by the horsebacked Border Patrol agents. Right. And who knows where it came from, and who knows whether it was actually Border Patrol agents. It was something that some Democrat staffer had found on the internet. And then there was like a sequence of Democrat representatives saying, we want to know what's going on in the psyche of the people who made this. And Marjorie Taylor Greene just said, freedom of speech means freedom to be offensive, freedom to be wrong. And she's like, I don't approve of this, but I'm going to say people have a right to make these things. Because what's the alternative? To have the government?
The alternative is the Psychological Defense Agency of Sweden, which is formed in 2022 against disinformation. Okay, that's anyway. Go ahead, Adrian.
But I thought that they said psyche, and I just thought, damn,
really, I know
they really want this.
Orwellian.
Yeah, and I think right now it is true that simply holding the line on, established what we thought were accepted bourgeois norms, principles, laws, rights, etc., is itself a fight, and a fight against much darker forces at this point. But I think it's also a sign of how dire our circumstances are, that we can't even contemplate anything more radical than it's already a stretch just to prevent the erosion of rights, etc., that were enshrined only over the course of the past 2 centuries and are quickly being unraveled. And any kind of agenda for like a more ambitious revolutionary program obviously just seems utopian in the worst hopelessly unrealistic sense.
It's worse than that. Like, people who want that utopian program to be enacted will not accept that they need to fight for this right.
That's right. And that's what I'm saying is, making the perfect the enemy of the not horrible is the wrong move at this point, I think, given, like a good Gramscian, conjunctural analysis of our landscape and of the ideological, trench warfare we're enmeshed in is such that, that's our near-term struggle just to hold the line on the outer ring of basic minimal bourgeois rights is already fierce enough. Yes, that's not that shouldn't be our stopping point, but my God, we're at least have to do that.
The fear, I think, again, why the bourgeois norms would appear not to apply. I think that it was Jimmy Kimmel who said, like a couple of weeks ago, who said it's precisely the people who don't want the government to tell them what to do who need to be told what to do by the government. And I just thought, okay,
that's always the case. I mean, that is always what if the state doesn't need to tell you what to do, then it doesn't.
Right.
If you're not causing trouble, then they don't give you trouble.
I just thought, okay, we've come to this place where I think that there's a distrust that freedom now is like a right-wing concept according to the Democratic Party, and that basically it's like if you want your freedom, you must be up to no good.
Yeah,
I remember in 2002 when I was very adamantly opposed to the Patriot Act, and I would tell people, look, they're surveilling what books you read. They're keeping a profile on your thoughts, and they're probably going to read your emails. They're surveilling us all, and that was 2002. And I had friends who were not political, not leftists, but friends who were just regular people who would say, I'm not doing anything that they should care about, right?
That's where I would be, an enemy of the Frankfurt School. I'd be like down with Karl Popper, the open society, right? Like his whole conception, which, is a kind of distressed liberalism from the 20th century. But I think these socialists really shouldn't disagree with this, which is that the open society is a dangerous society, meaning that, it's like the classic, like freedom from and freedom to, positive and negative, liberty. Like it's like, trading security for, freedom, and you get neither, right? And so just the idea that Popper had, that to do science, you need an open society, which means a society of danger and risk, rather than a society of security, that a society of security is the enemy of science. And that's true. Like, in other words, very straightforward. You don't have
can see that right now with COVID.
Right.
You can see that directly with the vaccines and with COVID and all of it. Go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah, but it depends on what we mean by danger and risk. And if it's the capitalist version of, 90+% of humanity is basically going to be on the short end of the socioeconomic stick, then
no.
Yeah,
right.
no. Right. Certainly not that. But I think, also, of course, there are Marxist versions of this. I mean, one could just simply trot out Mao's let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. Now, of course, you might say, well, in practice, the manner in which these sorts of discussion groups went under Maoism wasn't exactly what we have in mind by an open, debating forum. But still, I mean, there is this, and, one has to, of course, also recognize that there was a lot of experimentation along these lines too, and a real openness in the, during the Leninist phase, in Russia, that, and of course, like working on things like Freudian Marxism. I mean, you had figures like Luria and Vygotsky doing very interesting work in terms of Freud in relation to historical materialism that then all, ground to a halt once Stalinism, was in place. But that there, it certainly seems as though you have examples from the history of even just really existing socialism where there is this understanding that, that kind of intellectual openness, is crucial. And if it originates with certain bourgeois values, yes, well, this is just part of how Marxism involves the idea of some of those as ingredients for the further development beyond capitalism itself.
Right. It's made a mockery of, like, bourgeois freedom is made a mockery of in capitalism. And certainly someone like Popper did not want neoliberalism, even if he was associated with the order of liberals, because at a certain level, they took socialism for granted. I think that they couldn't imagine that we would arrive where we are now, actually.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I'm having a hard time imagining it, and even while it's happening right in front of me. Listen, thank you both for coming on. I'll let you both know when this is going up. It'll probably be next week sometime. I'm gonna end the recording. But again, thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.